Between the 19th and 26th of September 1939, Adolf Hitler set up personal headquarters inside a grand seaside hotel on the Baltic coast, using its elegant rooms to direct the invasion of Warsaw, less than 200 miles to the south, traveling from its lobby to the outskirts of the besieged Polish capital and back again each day. Fewer than 6 years later, the Red Army marched into that same town, and the people who had built it, generation after generation of German spa visitors, hoteliers, and their families, were expelled entirely. In some accounts, driven out literally into the sea at gunpoint. The town's name was changed on the spot, from the German Sopot to the Polish Sopot, and an almost entirely different population, Polish settlers with no ancestral connection to the resort whatsoever, moved into houses and hotels that had been built for people who no longer existed there at all. Most towns that lose their entire founding population lose their reason for existing along with it. Sopot didn't. Today it draws roughly 2 million visitors a year to a resident population of under 40,000, walks the same half-kilometre wooden pier that German aristocrats once strolled arm in arm, and functions in almost every practical sense, exactly the way its original French-born founder designed it to function 2 centuries ago, for a nation that didn't even exist as a resort clientele when he first built it. That's the strange mechanism at the centre of this story, and it doesn't really have a clean parallel anywhere else on this list. Normally, when a resort town empties out, the buildings survive and the people who once used them scatter elsewhere, leaving behind an identity everyone still recognizes even as the crowds thin. In Sopot, the buildings survived, the resort industry itself survived, the pier and the Grand Hotel and the whole physical apparatus of a 19th century spa town survived almost entirely intact, but the entire population using it was replaced within months, wholesale, by people who had never set foot in the place before and had no say in its design. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, the town kept being exactly the kind of place it was built to be, just for an entirely different set of people speaking an entirely different language. The first written mention of Sopot dates back to 1283, describing a small fishing village living quietly in the shadow of the far larger and more powerful port city of Gdansk, known to German speakers as Danzig, just a few miles up the coast, one of the dominant trading powers of the entire southern Baltic. For centuries it stayed exactly that, a minor fishing hamlet with nothing to distinguish it from dozens of similar villages along the Baltic shore, its wooden houses clustered along a low scarp, dividing the town into a hilly, forested upper section and a flat lower stretch running down to the beach. Ownership passed through various noble families over the centuries, the Przebandowskis and later the Sierakovskis among them, who built modest manor houses on the site, one reportedly raised on the ruins of an old Swedish estate, but did little to develop the settlement into anything more ambitious than a private country retreat. What eventually changed the town's fortunes was Prussia's annexation of the wider region, which transformed the sleepy village of Sopot into Sopot, a name that would define the place for the following century and a half, and which caught the attention of a very particular kind of visitor, the Prussian aristocracy, the Junker landowning class who began arriving for the sea air and the fashionable new novelty of Baltic bathing as a form of medical treatment. The man who actually built a resort out of that raw novelty was Jean-Georg Hafner, a French-born physician who had served as a military doctor in Napoleon's army during its campaigns across Central Europe, and who simply stayed behind in the Danzig region after French troops withdrew in 1814, rather than returning home to a France left exhausted and diminished by decades of continuous war. In 1823, Hafner secured an exclusive license from Prussian authorities to establish and operate a spa-style resort in Sopot, along with a hereditary leasehold over the beachfront land he needed to build it, a legal arrangement that gave him and his descendants effective control over the town's entire future direction. Working almost entirely with his own money rather than outside investors, he built and financed a spa hotel and a series of bath pavilions himself, betting that Baltic seawater, marketed correctly to the right clientele as a genuine medical treatment rather than mere recreation, could be sold as therapy for the ailments of wealthy urban Europeans, rather than simply endured as scenery on a family holiday. In 1827, he added a modest wooden walkway extending just over 30 meters into the bay, built specifically so bathers could reach deeper, cleaner water more easily for their treatments, dismantled each winter and rebuilt again each spring. It was meant to be purely functional, a piece of medical infrastructure rather than a landmark. It would eventually become the second most recognizable structure in the entire town, after the Grand Hotel that came later. Hafner died only a few years into the project, before he could see how complete his gamble would pay off, and his son-in-law, Ernst Adolf Böttcher, took over the resort and kept building on the foundation he'd left behind. The bet paid off decisively. Sopot's population climbed from just under 3,000 in 1874, past 17,000 by 1914, while annual visitor numbers reached 20,000 in the years just before the First World War, a genuinely remarkable ratio for such a small town. That original 30-meter walkway kept growing alongside the resort itself, extended to 150 meters as demand increased, then to over 300 by 1910, and finally, following a major reconstruction completed in 1928, to 511.5 meters, a length that made it, and still makes it today, the longest wooden pier anywhere in Europe. The legitimization of Sopot's ambitions as a genuinely fashionable resort arrived directly from the top of German society. Kaiser Wilhelm II himself became a regular and enthusiastic visitor to the spa, and on the 8th of October 1901, he personally granted the town official city rights by imperial decree, an honor that instantly elevated its status among Prussia's wealthy vacationing class. After the First World War, under the Treaty of Versailles, Sopot found itself inside the newly created Free City of Danzig, a strange semi-autonomous territory wedged uneasily between Germany and the reborn state of Poland, and the resort adapted without missing a beat, opening a casino inside its Grand Spa house in 1920 that quickly became one of the tiny statelet's primary sources of tax revenue. In 1927, the resort's crowning architectural statement, the Grand Hotel, originally known as the Casino Hotel, opened its doors, quickly becoming a magnet for high society, celebrities including Marlene Dietrich and, as it would soon turn out, considerably darker company. That darker company arrived in September 1939. When Germany invaded Poland, Hitler personally used the Grand Hotel as his field headquarters for a week, traveling from its rooms to the outskirts of Warsaw twice to observe the siege of the Polish capital in person, before returning each evening to a resort built entirely for aristocratic leisure and rest. It's a detail that sits uneasily beside everything Hafner had originally built the town to represent: health, recovery, and escape from exactly the kind of continental conflict now being planned from inside his own creation, in rooms designed for convalescing spa guests rather than military commanders. The war that followed devastated the wider region far beyond Sopot itself, and when the Red Army finally entered the town on the 23rd of March 1945, roughly 10% of its buildings were burned, including much of the historic spa and casino district at the town's core, the same streets that had once hosted Kaiser Wilhelm's carriage, and briefly, a German dictator planning an invasion. What followed mattered even more than the physical damage, and it's the detail that makes Sopot's story genuinely unlike anywhere else on this list. The entire German population, the descendants of the aristocrats, hoteliers, and spa workers who had built Sopot across 5 generations of continuous investment, was expelled from the town almost immediately, part of the vast forced population transfers that redrew Central Europe's demographic map in the war's aftermath, sanctioned at the highest levels by the Allied powers themselves. Polish settlers, many of them themselves displaced from territory further east, now absorbed into the Soviet Union, moved into the empty houses and hotels in their place, inheriting buildings, furniture, and even guest registers belonging to people they had never met and would never meet. The town's name changed from Sopot to Sopot almost as a formality, a bureaucratic footnote to a far larger human replacement. By November 1945, the population had reached roughly 23,000 people, almost none of whom had any personal history in the place they now called home. What compounded in the decades after that replacement mattered as much as the replacement itself, and it's worth separating out exactly what each force actually did to the town. The new residents had no inherited stake in the resort's founding identity, no family connection to Hafner's original vision or to the generations of hoteliers who had refined it. Nothing but the physical buildings he and his successors had left standing. Poland's new communist government nationalized the town's private spas, hotels, and sanatoriums, beginning in 1946, converting Sopot's entire hospitality economy overnight from private enterprise built on repeat wealthy clientele into state-run enterprises answering to the Ministry of Health rather than to paying guests chasing luxury. Central planners, meanwhile, consistently favored investment in industrial hubs like nearby Gdansk's shipyards over resort towns that produced nothing measurable in 5-year plans, leaving Sopot's population to stagnate for decades, growing only modestly through the entire communist era rather than resuming anything like its pre-war boom. An isolation from the West under communist rule cut Sopot off almost entirely from the kind of international visitor Hafner had originally built the resort to attract, replacing Berlin aristocrats and Prussian nobility with domestic Polish tourists and the occasional visitor bussed in from elsewhere in the Eastern Bloc, a smaller and far less lucrative clientele than the one the town's infrastructure had been built to serve. Sopot's revival remarkably began from inside that isolation, rather than after it ended, which is perhaps the strangest twist in a story already full of them. In 1961, a Polish composer and Polish radio music director named Władysław Szpilman helped launch the Sopot International Song Festival, one of the only genuine cultural bridges between Eastern and Western musicians anywhere in the Soviet bloc during the height of the Cold War. Held at the open-air Forest Opera Amphitheatre carved into the hillside above the town, it drew performers from as far away as Cuba, Nigeria, Mongolia, and New Zealand alongside acts from across Western Europe, becoming, for a few weeks each August, a rare and closely watched crack in the Iron Curtain, broadcast on television screens across the entire Eastern Bloc to audiences who otherwise had almost no exposure to Western pop culture at all. Between 1977 and 1980, it briefly rebranded as the Intervision Song Contest, an explicitly Soviet-organized answer to Eurovision designed to showcase socialist-aligned pop music to a socialist audience, before reverting to its original format and continuing, with occasional interruptions and rebrandings, into the present day, now broadcast by private Polish television networks rather than state media. The pier that Hafner built for Prussian bathers now belongs almost entirely to people with no connection to him at all, and it hardly seems to matter to anyone who actually visits. Poland's accession to the European Union in 2004 reopened Sopot fully to Western tourism for the first time since before the war, ending decades of communist-era isolation and triggering a fresh wave of visitors drawn by the same combination of beach, architecture and nightlife that had drawn Berlin's elite over a century earlier, only now arriving by budget airline rather than private railway carriage. The Grand Hotel, restored to its original grandeur in a major 2006 renovation, now operates under the Sofitel brand, its guest list once again including celebrities and heads of state rather than occupying armies, its former drawing rooms hosting weddings and conferences instead of invasion planning. Today, Sopot's roughly 35,000 permanent residents host more than 2 million tourists every summer, a ratio that would have looked entirely familiar to Jean-Georg Hafner, even if not a single person walking his pier today shares a single drop of blood, a single family name, or a single word of language with anyone he actually built it for 200 years ago. The resort survived losing every person who made it. What it never lost was the simple, oddly durable idea a French army doctor had in 1823, that people would always pay to stand at the end of a wooden pier and look at the sea. The German actor Klaus Kinski was born here in 1926, in a Sopot that no longer exists in any meaningful sense. Poland's own former Prime Minister lists Sopot as home today, in a Sopot that Kinski's own family would barely recognize. Neither fact cancels the other out. Both are simply true, layered one on top of the other on the same stretch of Baltic sand, the way this particular town seems to specialize in holding two entirely different histories at once, without ever quite reconciling them.